I have no idea if this lighting is going to be okay or not, but we're going to find out. Hello, lovely people of the internet, and welcome to episode 6 of the NovelTea Knitting Podcast. I'm your host, Emma, here to talk to you about all things knitting, bookish, basically anything cozy that takes my fancy. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a real quick thank you to anyone who came and joined me last Friday for my live stream, my frogging live stream. We got so much done. I frogged my Schnee and my no frills and 2 out of the 3 socks. The whole thing took 3 hours, so whether you stayed for the whole time or just popped in now and then, I really appreciate you coming, and I had a really good time. So hopefully I will be doing similar things in the future. Now, for anyone joining us for the very first time, this podcast comes to you in 2 parts. Part number 1 is knitting content. I will talk with you first about my finished objects and then my works in progress, and basically it's just talking about what I'm loving and maybe what I'm struggling with. Part number 2 is bookish content. So in that one, we're going over what I've been reading, what I've finished, what I'm reading currently. Regardless of what you're interested in, everything is timestamped below so you can jump around to your heart's content. If you're just here for the whip segment, then you can skip right on to that. And if you're here for the books segment, then you can skip to that as well. I also make sure that I link absolutely everything that I talk about, from the books that I talk about to the patterns, down in the description below. So you can check that out if you're curious about any of the things that I talk about. But anyway, grab a cup of tea and let's get started. First up, of course, is my finished objects segment, and I only have 1 item on this list for you guys today. That's okay. I finished my Christmas garden socks. I have gotten so many compliments about these from friends and family. Basically, anytime I pulled these out to work on them, someone was saying, "Oh, that's pretty. What are you working on?" Well, I mean, with like my parents and stuff, I'm always showing off the things that I'm working on, and they kind of have an obligation to ooh and ah over them, but I like to think that it's genuine. But these in particular got lots and oohs and ahs, especially from my mom. So I have actually been thinking about calling my local yarn store. I think that I want to know if they have any of the Arnie and Carlos Pairfect just in any of the colorways. But if they happen to have this one in stock as well, I might snatch some of that up. And if my local yarn store doesn't have it, honestly, it's gotta be somewhere, right? I don't think that it's not being dyed anymore, so hopefully I'll be able to find me some more of these colorways, because they were such a fun knit. In particular, I really loved coming to this bit here, because this thick stripe just would knit up so quickly, and it really feels like you're knitting some kind of pattern into it. As you can see, it's just like some randomly placed bits of color or bits of dye, but it feels like you're almost knitting up color worked or something. But anyway, beautiful socks, very comfortable. I am really annoyed that I'm on a yarn embargo at the moment because I'm trying to save up money for an advent calendar, because I really want some more of this. Not that I don't already have more than enough self-striping sock yarn, because I have 3 different kinds of Felici, plus a couple of other self-striping that I've picked up here and there. So I'm good to go on the self-striping sock yarn, but I always want more. Especially with self-striping sock yarn, because I love knitting self-striping socks so much. It's something that I can do so easily when I'm out and about. When I'm in the car especially, they're useful, because I get car sick when I do something that takes too much concentration. I have never been able to read in the car, and so having to look down at a pattern a bunch especially makes it really difficult for me. But with this, it's just knit all the way around, and so I don't even really have to look at my needle when I'm knitting a self-striping sock, and I'm getting something really fun out of it. Anyway, I can talk more about that in the whip segment, because I have cast on another self-striping sock. But I think that's all the segue that I need to move on to works in progress. first up is my falling snow socks. As you can see, I haven't gotten a lot of progress with these. Even though I absolutely love working on sock patterns, I often find them a little bit hard to get started when it actually comes to the knitting. I just love doing the vanilla socks so much, and it always takes me just a little while to get the pattern memorized enough that I don't have to constantly check it, even when it's my own pattern, and I'm just not really that patient. And so I will often just kind of avoid for a little while casting on something where I know I'm going to have to memorize the pattern, even though with my own patterns, it usually only takes me one repeat, and then I can fly through the rest of it because I don't have to look at it anymore. With other people's patterns, it usually takes me 2 or 3 repeats, but still, it's not that much. I really just need to do it. But I really am loving working with this yarn. I think that I made the right choice for sure with this cream color. I think it's going to make a really beautiful, really delicate snowflake. I also just real quick wanted to show off the needle holder that I am using for this project because I have a whole bunch of these. My friend Taylor used to make these and she would sell them with her hand-dyed yarn. And so when she stopped dyeing yarn and stopped doing the company, she let me have a ton of them, and I must have like 7 or 8 of the Christmas ones. At least 7 or 8, maybe more. And I just love the variety that it gives me. I use a different one of these for every project, if you haven't noticed already. I just try to always pick what I feel like goes with the pattern or the yarn that I'm working with best, or the feel that I want to get. For example, when I was knitting my falling rain socks, they were in something that I felt was quite springy and bright. So I just think that's kind of fun. But also, I have decided what my 4th season sock is going to be. So I have been working on making my own patterns. I made and released my falling leaves pattern. Let me throw in some shameless self-promo here. Link in the description down below if you would like to check that out, along with the discount code for viewers of this channel. That discount code is only going to be good for 2 more weeks, so make sure that you check that out if you would like that pattern. But anyway, I did falling leaves socks. I have started writing the pattern for the falling rain socks. I fully knit those up and I'm just having a little bit of trouble writing out the pattern. And then of course I have my falling snow socks, which leaves just one season, which is summer, but nothing really falls in summer. I mean, you get a little bit of rain, but that's definitely more of a spring thing. So rather than doing falling something, I decided to do shining rays. And so I've been trying to figure out the pattern in my brain and figure out exactly how I'm going to do it, and I cannot tell you guys how much I enjoy coming up with patterns. Car rides in particular are just the best for brainstorming patterns because I will just sit in the sunshine. My husband always drives because I do not like to drive and my husband does like to drive. I will just sit in the sunshine, we'll have a little bit of music playing in the background, and I will just start like picturing how certain things would show up on a stockinette background. I'll start tweaking things to make sure that it's going to work in my brain, and then I will eventually get around to actually writing out the pattern. I usually will use like Excel or something like that, but I always find it just such a fun process, and the fact that I am publishing these patterns just it makes it all that much more fun because I know that other people are also going to knit these patterns. So all that to say that I have another 3 patterns in the works at the moment, and I cannot wait to get them all knitted up and finished and written and uploaded, but that's coming. It's going to be a fairly slow process, I think. I am still very new to pattern writing, so I am still kind of learning the ropes. I'm trying to stick to really easy projects, things like socks and shawls, because I definitely cannot do sizing when it comes to like sweaters and things. I could definitely write up a pattern for exactly one size of sweater, mine, but I really need to take some lessons or something like that in pattern writing for multiple sizes. Anyway, that was quite a long tangent, so we'll move on to my other whip, which is my Holly Jolly socks. Now these are called my Holly Jolly socks because that is the name of the colorway. As you can see, it's a very tiny cake, but for anyone that popped into my live stream, they'll know that the reason that this is so small is because this is what I took out of the sock that I had previously knit. So this was one of the many things that I managed to frog on the live live stream, and just as I said it in the live stream, and I'm pretty sure in the last episode, I cast these on as soon as I could, probably sooner than I should have. I probably should have steamed this yarn a little bit more to get out some of this crimping from having been knit into a sock for so long, but I don't even care. I wanted these socks so badly. Literally every time I take these out, it is such a huge joy for me. The only thing dampening that joy is the fact that I have a weird setup when it comes to my double-pointed needles. I always knit my socks on size US 1s, and I technically have 2 sets of them, but the reason that I have 2 sets is because my first set got a chip in one of the needles, and so I needed to replace it. So I have 9 of these double-pointed needles, so I will just take the working needle and swap that between my sock knitting projects. It would make my life so much easier if I would just buy another set of them, but I just haven't gotten around to it. They're like $12 or something. I just feel like when I buy needles that they're cheaper than what they actually end up being. Like, in my mind, needles are only like $5 or something, and maybe that's what they are at Joann's, and that's where I get that. But no, these Knitter's Pride Dreams are like $10 to $15, depending on what Amazon feels like pricing them at that day. And you can see that I have a very appropriately Christmassy needle holder once again. So next up, I'm going to talk to you guys about my Schnee Cardigan. Technically speaking, I have not cast this on again yet, but I finished winding up all of the yarn. I don't think that it was in the project long enough for it to really get crimped up too badly. So I think that I might just start it as soon as possible. I will probably cast this on again. Well, I will definitely cast this on again before the next episode, but probably within the week I will have this cast on again. I have decided to go with the size US 9. That is several needle sizes larger than what the pattern calls for, but I think that my yarn holding this fingering weight yarn double actually ended up maybe a little bit more than a DK weight, but whatever the reason, it makes a very thick fabric, and so I decided to go with the size 9. The 8 was a close contender, and I really had to think about it, but when it comes down to it, I just really like the feel of this fabric with the 9, and I think that's the most important thing. So I'm going to make it work on much larger needles. Last thing on the list is in this lovely monogrammed bag that I got from my friend's mother for my wedding. It's got my initials, my new initials. Well, they're not new anymore. My husband and I have been married for over a year, but at the time they were my new initials, and so it was really cool to see this big old J right here. But this bag has my Banff sweater in it. I am so excited about this sweater, and I'm really pleased with how it's turning out. So I did decide to fade the yarn in this sweater rather than just doing color blocking on it, and I stand by that decision because I think it looks beautiful, especially, I mean, the green into this tan color isn't my favorite, but as soon as you go from the tans into the oranges like this, that looks so perfect. They look so good together. And it has been a huge pain in the butt. There's been a lot of yarn cutting, and my edges look absolutely atrocious. So when I come to the end, if I come to either a yarn from the previous color or from that same color that I was working with, I will just grab it and just knit double for a few stitches, just so that I don't have to weave in 500 ends by the end of this project. Maybe it'll just be like 50 or something, because I am not able to do that with every single end. I don't want to be doing like 3 at once, which I would have to do in order to get literally all of them. So even though my edges look absolutely horrendous, I don't think it really matters because this is a sweater that gets seamed. So this is the back panel, and then I have 2 front panels to do and the sleeves. I was thinking that I might just do color blocking on the sleeves, or maybe I will do helical knitting. I think helical knitting would work for this. Maybe. I'll have to look into that a bit more. I have had a rather large mistake already in this pattern, and it had nothing to do with the pattern itself and everything to do with my fading. So I have 7 colors to fade through this, and I had gone from this rust color straight into this red without realizing that I had completely skipped over this orange. And I absolutely 100% need to include that orange, and I wasn't going to do it after the red because after this red comes a different red. You cannot tell that these are different colors. They are. One is heathered, so this one is supposed to be like a heathered yarn, and then this one is just solid red. If you can't super tell the difference once I put it into the sweater, I'm not going to be too broken up about it. But yeah, I had done the entire fade section, and it had started in on just the solid section with this red before I realized that I was supposed to do the orange before the red. So I had to take out all of those rows, most of which I had cut. This yarn is in several pieces wrapped around here, and I'm just going to have to make sure when I start it up again that I don't use too much of the end, like so that I don't have too much of this hanging off, because it's a very exact amount of yarn and I definitely don't have a replacement for this. So it's going to be a little bit of a shaky situation when I get to that, but I'm not there yet and I'm not going to think about it. This fading, by the way, takes 18 rows. So I not only have a bunch of this cut, but the yarn, I've cut several pieces in this as well. And so this is what I'm fading from and what I'm fading into. So this sweater has been in timeout for a little while because I just needed to step away from it. I will be getting back to it within the week because I am really, really excited for this sweater. I did make I don't want to say a creative choice, but besides the fading, I also changed up the pattern. The pattern calls for a size US 11 needle, which is an 8mm needle. So these are US 10s, and these are only 6mm. And that is a very big jump. From a 10 to an 11 is one of the biggest jumps in needle sizes that I have in my collection. And I decided to do that because I know from experience that wool grows like nobody's business. The very first cardigan that I ever knit, I knit in 100% wool, and I absolutely loved it before I blocked it, and then I blocked it, I wet blocked it, and it grew so much that I couldn't wear it. The sleeves were way too long, and the body was way too long, and you know that the sleeves are way too long if I won't wear them, because I usually like my sleeves out to about here, I would say, usually, and these sleeves, they went way, way too far, so I had to roll them back, and I didn't really like the feel of having rolled them back. That sweater now belongs to my mom, by the way. So I didn't want to make the same mistake with this one. Even though this one is supposed to be super oversized, it is a huge, oversized, amazing sweater. But the sweater pattern calls for acrylic yarn, and I just wasn't sure if that was going to grow quite as much as wool yarn would. And so this is still obviously going to be a huge sweater. I'm not too worried about it. It just might not be quite as oversized as what I was thinking it was going to be, but only time will tell. Of course, if I had just swatched, I would know already exactly how much the yarn was going to grow. But I didn't, and that was probably dumb. I have been doubting my decision to go with 10s instead of 11s since I got into, I think, about the 3rd color or so. I just started getting worried that by the time I got to 7, it wasn't going to be quite enough. This does, like, it stretches so much when I pull on it, so I don't know. Does this sense ever go away for any of you longtime knitters? Do you ever become confident in your choices, whether you swatch or you don't swatch, or when it comes to your understanding of different fabrics? So like for me, knowing that wool stretches, and so making the call to go with a smaller needle size, does that uncertainty with yourself ever go away? Or is it just a me thing in the first place? Is it just because of my touch anxiety that I get nervous about anything that I make for myself? Let me know down in the comments below. But that is everything in my knitting segment. So if you were just here for the knitting content, thank you so much, and I hope to see you back here in 2 weeks. If you're here for the bookish content, we'll be moving on to that next. So as far as what I've read goes, I have finished a whole lot of the Night Huntress series, but I will get to that because first I want to talk about A Cuban Girl's Guide to Tea and Tomorrow by Laura Taylor Namey. So in the last episode, returning viewers will know that I was complaining a lot about this book. In particular, the main character, Leela. I just found her really condescending, very annoying. I was really hoping for some character growth. And guys, I got it. I got my character growth! There was one line in particular that stuck out to me that proved not only that I was right in what I found annoying about Leela, but also that she grew while she was in England, and in particular, she grew in the way that I had wanted her to. I suppose before I get into that I should give you a quick synopsis of this book. In this book, Leela has just suffered a series of heartbreaks, from her grandmother dying, to her boyfriend leaving her, to her best friend leaving her. And so she's completely heartbroken. Her family decides that she needs a break from her home city of Miami, and they send her to England to live with a relative who runs a bed and breakfast. Leela is an amazing baker, and she learned to bake from her grandmother. She's actually going to be taking over the bakery when she returns to Miami that her grandmother left to her and her sister. Let me read you this line that has me so excited. At home, I saw no reason to learn more, but being here and getting out of my little Miami corner changed all that. It's reminded me that the world is bigger than my neighborhood, and my skills could be bigger too. That was the thing that bothered me the most about Leela, is it seemed like that she thought she knew everything there was to know, or everything that mattered, and she didn't want to learn anymore. And I just found that such an annoying trait. So I was beyond excited when I read that line, because I had kind of seen that growth coming along, but I didn't really register it until she gave me that line. I won't spoil any more of what goes on in the book than that, but let's just say that she definitely begins to understand that she does have more to learn, that at 17 she doesn't know everything there is to know, and she begins to recognize that other things matter besides just her little square of the world in Miami. I did listen to this book on audiobook, and I did not love the narration. I found it really difficult sometimes to tell when Leela was just talking to herself and when she was talking to other people. A lot of times in books, you don't really think about this when you're just reading, but when you have dialogue followed by inner dialogue followed by more dialogue, it's sometimes really difficult to tell when and who is speaking and what they're saying, and whether it's supposed to be to other characters or if it's just to themselves. I don't really know how other narrators do this. I would have to actually be thinking about it. I don't actually notice until it's a problem, as it was in this book. I also really didn't like the way that this narrator did British accents. I am not good enough with accents to know if her British accent was really bad, or if it was just like a variation or a localization that I wasn't familiar with. I'm pretty sure the narrator was chosen because she either could speak or could speak with an accent that was Spanish, because the characters do speak in Spanish every once in a while, just a few words or phrases here and there. And I imagine that because the book is from Leela's perspective, that's more important anyway. But I would have liked to have both the Spanish accent and the British accent. Would that have been too much to ask? I suppose it would have been Spanish, British, and American. You would have had to be good at all three. Going back to what I actually liked about the book, I thought that the balance of conflicts in the book was really, really good. Like, next level really good. I never felt like any one of the conflicts or the things that were causing drama stuck around too long. I didn't feel like there were too many that any of them didn't get the appropriate amount of screen time. Whether it was kind of settling Leela's emotional traumas, or it was some of the more local drama, it all felt like it got the exact right amount of resolution as well as the amount of anticipation. And that's really hard to do, so that's quite impressive. Overall, though, I wouldn't say that I loved this book. I would go so far as to say I liked it. This author does have a few other books as well. They just don't really pique my interest quite like this one did. So I won't be reading those, but if she were to come out with another teen romance, I would probably pick it up again. In the last 2 weeks, I have also finished Knitlandia by Clara Parks. This book was kind of more of a series of essays, so each chapter catalogs a different story from a different place in the world. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I will say that I had 3 that were definitely my favorites. The first one was her trip to Iceland. I don't imagine that I will ever go to Iceland in the way that Clara Parks did. I would love to go and visit Iceland and spend time there with my husband, but Clara Parks went on a very specific knitting trip and she taught a class and stuff like that. Nothing like that will probably ever happen to me, so it was really cool to see this trip through her perspective. It was also, I want to say, quite a long time ago, relatively speaking. I would have been quite a young child, I think, when she took this trip, and so just kind of seeing what traveling was like and how it was different and how knitting was different, how the groups that organized around knitting were different. There was lots of things to love in the Iceland story, but my absolute favorite was the sheep organizing party. I guess that's the only way that I can really think to describe it. In Iceland, there are just tons and tons and tons of sheep, and they're allowed to roam free over the island, and eventually they all have to be corralled and sorted so that each individual farmer can take his or her sheep home and do whatever they're going to do with the sheep. Obviously shear them and whatever else. But the fact that Clara Parks was able to participate in this event, which is clearly like a very local event. I never saw it coming, first of all, and I thought it was really cool. It was really fun to read her description of it. She doesn't shy away from describing when things don't go as planned, when things don't feel quite right, when things that you were super excited for didn't end up being the highlight of the trip and things like that. In that vein, my second favorite story was her Paris story, and this one was more because I could really relate to her story. She moved to France at some point when she was quite young, and she had planned on staying there for a long time, but then she found France to be actually quite unwelcoming, and she felt really out of place, especially as an American, and I can completely relate to that. I guess I haven't talked about it much on this channel, so I'll give you the abbreviated version. Basically, I moved to Paris when I was 22. I was going to go for graduate school. I was going to be there for 2 years, and then, hopefully, the rest of my life. I got through 1 semester, and by the end of that semester, I was so homesick and so depressed and so anxious that I had to come home. So I dropped out of school and I came back home and I had to just kind of piece my life back together. A lot of that was personal growth. I had a lot of mental health problems that I had to work through that I just couldn't do in that space. But I also just found France to be really unwelcoming. Wherever I went, I always felt like that dumb American. Even when I spent time with other people from other countries, they almost always were from Europe still. And no one necessarily specifically said, oh, you're the dumb American or anything like that, but I definitely felt out of place while I was living there. So Clara Parks in this story is going back to Paris for the first time in 21 years, and it's a really weird experience for her because so much has changed. She's changed. She's trying to still hold on to her good memories and not let the bad memories overtake them, and she's worried about how being in Paris will affect those memories. And while she's there, she has promised her family that she will not go to any yarn stores or buy any yarn, which personally I think is insane. Every trip we go on, I'm always looking up to see if there's any yarn stores around because I just love to have a bit of yarn to work with so that I can remember that trip while I'm knitting that yarn. Anyway, she does eventually end up going to a yarn store. Based on the writing, it sounded very much like she got a lot of closure by going to Paris again, and in particular, the yarn store that she went to, she didn't buy anything. Again, crazy woman. But she did manage to find a place where she felt welcome and included. Finally, my third favorite story, not necessarily in any particular order, but my other favorite story was her Rhinebeck story. This is a little bit like Iceland, where I don't expect that I will ever go to Rhinebeck. And it's not because it's not accessible to me. I live in Michigan. Rhinebeck is really not that far. But I really do not do well in crushing crowds like that. When it comes to to yarn festivals, I really like being able to go home afterwards and decompress because it's very stressful for me and especially for my anxiety. But from what I've read and what I've heard about Rhinebeck, I just don't think that I could handle that kind of a crowd. So I got to live vicariously through Clara Parks and her description of what Rhinebeck is like. She does a really good job of painting a picture of what it feels like to go to Rhinebeck, specifically what it feels like to go to Rhinebeck as a knitter and a yarn lover. The way that she described it, I found it really easy to understand because I have been to some more local fiber festivals and things like that. Rhinebeck is similar, just on the next level, but I really liked what she had to say about it. I'm gonna stop. You can't do that. It'll make it too difficult for Mom to talk. We all know how Mom likes to talk. One of the things that stuck out to me in this book in particular was the way that she described what the knitting community used to be like. I'm relatively new to the knitting scene. I'm only 26. So she was telling some of these stories that were from before I was born in some cases, but mostly from the 90s and the early 2000s. And that was all before I joined the knitting community. And it made it very clear to me two things. First, that the internet has made the knitting community so different than what it used to be like. And second, that I'm not sure I would have participated nearly as much in the knitting community if it weren't for the way that Ravelry and YouTube and Skillshare and things like this have changed the way that we function. So yeah, I definitely felt the generational gap in a few of her stories, but it gave me an interesting and a really cool insight into how things used to be. Okay, so next up is all the books that I have finished in the Night Huntress series by Jeaniene Frost. I'm just gonna go right ahead and let you guys know that I eat this series up like candy. I can get through one of these books in a day or less. I absolutely love them. The plot moves so fast, and I can listen to these books at 2 times speed or more sometimes, just because I've listened to them and I know these stories already. So I never feel like I miss anything because I already know most of the details. I just need to kind of put them back in order. I have a tendency to get details from each of the different books kind of mixed up. So in total, I have read 5 books in this series so far, but 2 of them were short stories or novellas. So, I mean, they were only 2 or 3 hours long, but all those books are Halfway to the Grave, Happily Never After, One Foot in the Grave, At Grave's End, and Devil to Pay. So we're gonna go through these one by one. I promise I will not linger on any one of them too long. I also want to say before I start getting into each one of these individually that some of these sex scenes are super graphic. It's all consensual, none of it is a rape scene or anything like that, but it gets weird sometimes because there are some quirks of vampire venom that mean that they can make them biting you pleasurable. And Jeaniene Frost really leans into that in a couple of places. But I just love the relationship between Cat and Bones too much to even skip over those sex scenes, even though they're way more graphic than what I have any interest in. So first in the series is Halfway to the Grave. My favorite thing in this book is the character growth. Cat starts out as this kind of country bumpkin, has a lot of prejudices against vampires, even though she herself is half vampire, and she meets Bones and things start to change. And by the end of the book, it's really cool to see how much she has grown emotionally, but also, this is probably one of my favorite parts, is how much she has grown in strength and power and wit and cleverness. One of the big things in these books is that she doesn't usually have more strength than the bad guys, but she is cleverer, she is more willing to kick people while they're down. That's a big thing in the book. So it's really cool to see her rise from this kind of petty bumpkin who has all these prejudices to someone who can seriously kick some vampire butt. So next up is Happily Never After, which is one of the short stories. All of the short stories seem to be about characters that are not the main characters, even though there are a couple places here and there where the main characters get dropped in. I don't know if any of these characters end coming up in later novels. I don't remember them by name, but that doesn't mean that they weren't dropped in somewhere because they have some relation to Bones or to Cat or something like that. So there were a few key takeaways for me from Happily Never After. First of all, I love a badass grandma. Greta is not a main character in this, but she is an important character, especially to the main character. It's her grandmother. I just love when grandmothers have this kind of secret past that either children or their grandchildren don't know that they have, and they turn out to be like way more progressive or way more open-minded than their kids or grandkids ever imagined that they would be. Which, as a side note, is part of why I'm really disappointed with Mrs. Perivale. I did decide that I was not going to finish that one. I couldn't even bring myself to read another chapter like I told you guys I was going to do last episode. But if anyone needs a lesson in how to make a grandmother or grandfather super badass, you gotta check out Jeaniene Frost. I also won't spoil the ending, but I will say that it was clever and I didn't see it coming. That might just be because I'm not that clever, or it might be because Jeaniene Frost is very clever. Either way, I really liked the ending. Next is One Foot in the Grave. This is the second book in the Huntress series. This book actually starts 4 years after the end of the first one, which I absolutely loved because it gives our main character a chance to have grown up even more than she did between the few months that the first book takes place. It allows her to grow up, especially into a leader, which she definitely is in this book. She already stops mostly being naive and prudish by the end of the very first book, but the second book takes it to the next level, and just seeing her become such a fantastic leader. She's very brutal with her team, but it is a brutal magical world that they live in, and it's just really cool to see how much she has and hasn't changed just by her interaction with her subordinates. While reading this book, I also realized what one of my absolute favorite thing about this series is, and it's the relationship between Cat and Bones, and the fact that there is not a constant will they, won't they. It's not that there is absolutely no drama between Cat and Bones, but there's never really any question that they are going to end up together, and so the author doesn't make it that big of a question. Usually the drama comes from something external rather than internal, and so the characters have to figure out how to beat it, and they have to figure it out together. And I vastly prefer that to books that have characters that are determined to do things alone, or that have fallen in love and they just can't tell the other person because what if they don't love them back, and all of that. I will say though that the drama in the Huntress series is gruesome. I would never ever be able to watch like a TV show or a movie adaptation of this book because the amount of blood and gore that gets described in this book is off the charts. But because it's all from Cat's perspective, Cat almost makes it a joke. Half the time I'm just kind of laughing at Cat's reaction to the way that someone has tried to kill her, or the way that she has had to kill someone else, because she's always having to think outside the box. She either describes things in such a clinical and professional way that you don't really think about the actual consequences, or she describes them in such a comical way that again, you still aren't really thinking about what has actually happened. And of course, Jeaniene Frost does a really good job of characterizing the people that do get killed as the bad guys. There's never like some kind of moral ambiguity. Either they are vampires or ghouls or whatever that are a direct threat to the main character or the people around her or humans in general, or they are in some way connected to that evil person. But while individuals are certainly characterized as bad or evil, there's never any sweeping assessment that all vampires are evil or all ghouls are evil or anything like that, which I really appreciate. At Gravesend is the third book in the Huntress series. I have all the same good things to say about it as I have for the previous ones. The only thing that I will add is that I am obsessed with the antagonist from this book. I honestly wish that Jeaniene Frost had. And then finally there is Devil to Pay, which is one of the short story novellas. All I have to say about this one is that I cannot believe sometimes the backstories that she comes up with for her characters. I don't know where she gets the ideas, but they're brilliant. The main vampire in this story is a Depression-era vampire who has lost everyone that she loved and cared about. She is really just existing rather than living, and watching her come back from that place is really fun. I also thought that this story did not outstay its welcome. I really liked it as a short story. I wouldn't mind mentions here and there of the main characters, but I thought that it was the perfect length to tell the story that she was telling. This story also reinforced another thing that I absolutely love that Jeaniene Frost does, which is the way that she portrays her love at first sight, or if not love at first sight, then falling in love really quickly, which almost always happens in romance novels. You usually fall in love with the other person in a matter of days or hours rather than what actually happens in real life, which is over a longer period of time. Jeaniene Frost manages the balance really well. They just know love with the gradual buildup of love. There are also always really good mental and emotional reasons along with physical attraction that explains why these two people have been falling in love, which is harder to do than you might expect. But that is it for what I have finished. We will move on to what I am currently reading. This list is maybe a bit longer than it ought to be because I have just kind of been starting books and starting books and starting books. I'm reading a few things that I'm having trouble kind of getting through, even though most of them are audiobooks. The gist of that being that I have 4 books to talk to you guys about that I am currently reading, not to mention books that I have started but haven't gotten into enough to actually talk about yet. So first up is Bone Crossed by Patricia Briggs. Before I get into this one, I want to talk a little bit more about Iron Kissed, which I talked about in the last episode. Iron Kissed was the previous book in the series. I said that I was giving the series one more chance because I just hadn't really liked the other ones, and Iron Kissed had a rape scene in it that really put me off. What I failed to realize was that I already knew how good Patricia Briggs is at dealing with rape in her stories. Because I have read the first couple of books in the Alpha and Omega series, and in that series, the main female protagonist, she has come from a pack where she was regularly raped. The thing in Iron Kiss that bothered me was that the rape scene was described in quite graphic detail, and I find that deeply uncomfortable, and I really hate having to read things like that. But I was worried about how Patricia Briggs was going to handle it and whether it was going to kind of be swept under the rug and prove to have just been something really dramatic to end her previous book with, or whether she was going to talk about it too much, which was also going to bother me. But I am more than halfway through Bone Cross right now, and I can tell you that I should have remembered Alpha and Omega and how good she was at having a main character who had experienced the trauma of being raped and of sexual assault. I should have realized just how good she was going to be at doing it with Mercy. It serves as a significant plot device in both stories because we get to see the characters dealing with the trauma. We get to see the result of the rape, which in Mercy's case results in regular panic attacks, several a day in most cases. We get to see how it affects their relationships, both Anna with her mate as well as Mercy with her mate, and how they both react quite differently, how they have different coping mechanisms, how they interact not only with their mate but also with anyone else that they have in their lives, and how that affects those relationships, in particular with men. So I will say that Bone Crossed so far is making me like this series a little bit more. I think one of the things that really put me off of the other books is the independent streak in Mercy. To explain this, let me compare Cat with Mercy, because Cat in the Night Huntress series is very similar to Mercy in a lot of ways. They're both really snarky, they're both really clever, they're both intelligent and independent and prideful, and they're both extremely brave and headstrong and stubborn. But I like it in Cat, and I was finding it quite annoying in the Mercy Thompson books, and I have been trying to figure out why, and I think I might have gotten it, but I have the rest of the series to figure it out. Mercy takes the independence too far. Like I said, both characters are prideful, but Mercy takes that pride and turns it into something that keeps her separate from other people. She also tries to keep herself separate from the magical world, from the fae and the vampires and the werewolves, because she is a walker and not in any of those groups. She thinks that that means that she can keep herself separate, and it's clearly not the case. At least in Bonecrossed, or at least so far in Bonecrossed, she seems to be coming to terms with why she feels the need to keep herself separate so much from these people that care about her, and she seems to be, at least to a small degree, embracing being part of the pack and part of these communities and part of these relationships, and that doesn't mean that those people owe her or that she owes them or anything like that. So I'm hopeful that as the series progresses, she will become more open. She would never become completely open because that is not Mercy Thompson, but I do think that she's making progress, and I really like that. Next up on my list of what I'm reading right now is Happier at Home by Gretchen Rubin. This is the sequel to The Happiness Project, which I read a couple weeks ago, and I am not sure if reading Happier at Home is necessary if you've read The Happiness Project. So far, I have not gotten anything out of it that I didn't already get out of The Happiness Project. There have even been some lines that were admittedly explanatory, but they were word for word what was out of The Happiness Project in some cases. So it's technically fine because you want to make sure your readers understand. You can't assume that they have read the previous one. But in this case, it just feels extremely repetitive. I think that probably what I'm going to say is that if you've read one, you don't have to read the other, but we shall see. Next up is To Scotland with Love by Patience Griffin. I decided to start reading this series over again because I read the second to last book in the series, Blame It on Scotland, and I was shocked by how much I didn't like the book because I have read the entire series. I loved them enough to purchase them, which, I mean, that's a pretty high bar for me. I have a tendency to either get books from the library or listen to them, and then if I really like them, I will buy them and just kind of have them. Sometimes I will reread them, but sometimes I just like them to sit on my shelf. So I own this whole series, and I don't know why. Because I don't really like To Scotland with Love either. I find it just as annoyingly back and forth. In Blame It on Scotland, I was so frustrated with the main character because she was so flip-floppy on whether or not she was okay with the fact that she was falling for the main guy. And I can't say that this one is that much better, if any better at all. Now that being said, while reading this series, I do remember this one being one of my least favorite, just because of the plot and the main character being a journalist. And there's a famous actor that lives in town that, of course, they're falling in love with each other. He lives in Gandygal for the privacy, and she is going to expose him to get her career back on track. Which, first of all, everybody knows that that is not going to happen because that would make her a terrible person. But the way that she goes back and forth sometimes, or the way that she has to constantly tell herself that she doesn't trust men, it feels really disingenuous. It actually reminds me of when I was a kid. I remember writing a story, and I don't know why this sticks out in my mind, but I always wanted to be a writer when I was a kid, and so I would write stories, or I would start stories. And there was one that I started. I don't remember very much about it, or what was even happening in this story, but I very distinctly remember that I wanted to have the equivalent of when a 14-year-old writes an enemies to lovers story. I wrote a couple chapters, and within those first couple chapters, the two main characters were getting along too well. And the way that I remedied that was by having the main character have thoughts about whether or not she could trust the other main character, the guy. And first of all, rather than just leaving it at that, I had her think those thoughts aloud. She said them aloud without realizing it, which put the other guy completely off of her because suddenly she's talking about not trusting him, and he says, "Did you know that you sometimes talk aloud when you're thinking?" and stuff like that, and it was so dumb. And obviously, To Scotland with Love is not quite that bad, but it's closer than it should be. And the last book on my list, as you might have expected if you were paying attention to the What I Finished segment, is the fourth book in the Night Huntress series, Destined for an Early Grave. I just would like to reiterate for this story, seriously, where does Jeaniene Frost come up with these ideas? Because they're so creative. So the premise for this story is that Cat and Bones have married each other by vampire law, but vampire law is like a blood binding. You are in it forever. You cannot marry someone else because you dislike the other person or you change your mind or anything like that. And so the premise of this story is that when Cat was 16, a series of things happened that resulted in her being essentially kidnapped, but also brainwashed, and marrying another vampire, and even though she was brainwashed into doing so, his claim stands for her. In order to make sure that Cat and Bones eventually met and fell in love, another one of the characters completely wiped her memory of the event of that month or so of her life, and now they're having to deal with the consequences of that, the fallout from that. And so the whole, like, memory wipe thing stinks a little bit of retconning, but I don't even care because it's super creative and I super love it. I love the way in these books that the relationship and the conflict weave together and complement one another rather than feeling like two separate plots. And that's something that happens a lot in romance novels specifically, so the fact that this is more of an urban fantasy / romance, that makes it easier to avoid that problem. But I just think that Jeaniene Frost does it so well, and I am just going to apparently gush about this woman for the rest of my life because I am so obsessed with this series. But that is everything for this episode, so please make sure to like and subscribe. Please comment down below, and remember that everything that I've talked about in this episode is linked in the description down below, so that is there for your convenience. But yeah, I will see you guys in 2 weeks. Bye!